Hi, hello everyone. My name is Vivek. I am a software developer. I make videos about containers, Kubernetes Go as a programming language, distributed systems, and sometimes about software engineering in general. So if you have been liking the kinds of videos that I make, you should consider subscribing to the channel and you should follow me on Twitter as well. In this particular video, we are going to implement the controller publish volume RPC of the controller plugin. Now, if you do not understand these terminologies, for example, what controller plugin is, what are RPCs, I highly recommend you watching my previous videos that we have made in this series where we are writing a CSI plugin from scratch. So up until now, what we have implemented is we have demoed that when we create a PVC resource on the Kubernetes cluster, create volume RPC of the plugin that we have written is going to get called or was being called. We have seen that was being called, and we have coded that in such a way that it calls the respective API in the storage provider, in our case DigitalOcean's APIs, to actually provision a volume in storage provider or in DigitalOcean. And in this particular video, we are going to implement another RPC from controller plugin called ControllerPublishVolume that actually attaches that created volume to a specific node. So this is what we are going to implement. If I this is the source code repo that where we have pushed our changes. If you want to check that out, you can check that as well. Let's go ahead and try to open the source code in our text editor. And if you see here, in controller publish volume, we have a log, and in the previous video I clearly showed that as soon as the volume is created successfully in the storage provider and the PVC resource that was created in the Kubernetes cluster, if we try to consume that PVC inside a pod or on a pod, in that case, a volume attachment resource would be created, and that eventually uh, would notify the external attacher sidecar that we have in the controller plugin pod here. If you see, external attacher should be somewhere here, and then this external attacher actually calls the controller publish volume. Again, if this is confusing you, I highly recommend you watching my previous videos. So let's go ahead and try to implement controller publish volume. So first of all, let's go ahead and try to look into the request that we get in controller publish volume RPC. So if you see here, we are getting volume ID. This is very obvious. Controller publish volume is called to attach a volume to a particular node. So in that case, it's obvious that we would need volume ID that needs to be attached to a particular node. Similarly, we would need node ID where we want that volume to be attached, and volume capability is another field. If you watched another videos, I have talked about volume capability in detail there as well. So if you see here, we can specify access mode as well as access type. So access mode can either be, for example, let's say read write once. uh, if you see here, these are some of the values. For example, single node writer, single node reader, or only in terms of Kubernetes, this is going to be, let's say, read write once, read write many, and things like that. So all these things are specified using volume capability. And read only, as you see here, I mean, as the name suggests, read only field specifies if the volume that is being attached is just going to be read only, and applications will not be able to write to that volume. So again, it depends on the storage provider if they actually support read only volumes or not. And if you see here, secrets is a field that can be used to, for example, let's say if we need a secret to make a call to an API that needs some credentials. In that case, we can have secrets there. And if you see here, volume context is another field, and this particular volume context is a field using which we can pass the values from create volume response. So if you remember in the previous videos, we whenever we create a PVC resource in Kubernetes, our CreateVolume RPC of the CSI plugin is going to get called, and let's assume that we want to pass some values from CreateVolume method to this particular method. When I say this particular method, I mean ControllerPublishVolume. So if you see here, when we called when create volume was called, we actually created the volume in the storage provider, and let's say our requirement was that we have to pass some values from create volume, and that value must be available, or in other words, we have to pass some values from create volume to controller publish volume. In that case, what we could have done is we could have set that value in in create volume response. So let me see. Volume context as returned by SP in create volume response volume context. So if you go again in create volume response, we could have set volume context here, and this volume context would obviously be passed to the controller publish volume. So I hope this makes sense. And again, if I try to summarize this, let's say there is a field, uh, for example, there is a variable, let's say volume name or volume ID, that needs to be shared between create volume and controller publish volume. In that case, we could have set that field in volume context. Now, we don't have that use case right now. That is the reason we did not set anything in volume context. We just set the volume. But yeah, if it was your requirement, you could do that. If we look into the request, those were the main fields that are there in the create volume request. So first of all, we will have to see if we got this particular request. First of all, these fields, some of the fields that are required must be set, and if they are set, we will have to see they are valid or not. So for example, volume ID must be set in the request, and this particular volume must be present on the cloud provider. So let's go ahead and try to do that. So check if volume ID is present and volume is available on storage provider. And the other thing that we will have to do is the same thing. We will have to check if node ID is set and node is actually present on cloud provider or storage provider. Once we have volume ID and node ID, we can also check if volume capability is set or not. Again, it depends on how do you want to, or how storage provider, what are the things that storage provider supports. Again, same goes with read only. If the storage provider that you are writing the CSI plugin for supports read only volumes, in that case you are going to check if read only is set and do the things according to that. And secrets and volume context, like I said, if we need something from create volume, we could have accessed that field from volume context, but we have not set anything from create volume in create volume response. That is the reason we don't need these things. So let's go ahead and try to see if volume ID is present. So context, and we are going to call it request. So if request dot volume ID is equals to nil, in that case we will have to return the response is going to be nil, and error is going to be status dot error, and code is going to be invalid argument because the request is not bad request basically. And the message is going to be volume ID is mandatory in controller publish volume request. And similarly, we will have to check if node id is present or not. So request dot node id, if this is equals to nil, in that case we have to do the same thing. So nil, and then status dot error codes dot invalid argument, and we have to say node id is mandatory in controller publish volume request. Once we have made sure that these fields are not actually empty, there is some value set, we'll have to actually see that this volume and this node is actually present in the cloud provider. So let's go ahead and try to get this volume to see if it's present or not. So we already have the storage client in the driver. So if you see here, we have storage service, and in storage service we have get volume, and this get volume can be used to actually get a volume, and we can check if the volume is present or not. So d dot storage dot get volume, and this expects a context and volume id. So we are going to pass request dot volume id, and this gets us volume response and error. So volume response and error. If error is not equals to nil, in that case it simply means that there was an error returned from get volume, and it was not able to list or get the volume successfully. So we are going to say, again, we can actually check the response to figure out what exactly the problem was. But in this case, just to make things easier, I'm just going to return that the volume is not available. But yeah, this is not a good practice, I would say. This call can fail because of any other reason. So that is the reason we will have to check and specifically be sure that this is failing because of volume not being available, just to better format or better form the error messages. So I'm going to return nil, and then status dot error, and this time it's going to be internal server error, and I would say volume is not available anymore. So now that the volume is available, what we can do is we will have to also see if this particular volume is already attached to a particular node or not. So check if the volume is already attached. If it's attached, in this particular case, we'll have to see if it's attached to the correct node, and or it's attached to a wrong node. And if it's attached to a wrong node, in that case we'll have to attach to the correct node. And if it's attached to a correct node already, in that case we can just return the response. I think you can do this. I'm not going to implement these functionalities in this particular video because yeah, it's going to be very lengthy. So I'm going to skip these things. And again, if you want to validate the other things from request, for example, volume capability, read only, you will have to check those as well. For example, or let me maybe comment here. So check if read only is set and you support read only volumes. So if read only is set and you don't support read only volumes, in that case you can just return from here. And you can also check volume capabilities. Once all these things are done, what we can do now is we can just call another API from DigitalOcean to attach this volume and the node. So to actually perform some actions on storage or on volumes, we will have to use another client, and that client is going to be storage storage action service. And if we go ahead and look into storage action service, if you see here, we have an attach method in this particular API or interface that takes volume ID and droplet ID, and it basically attaches that volume to the specified droplet ID. So this is what we are going to use now. So, and we will have to also initialize it. So storage action, and this is going to be client.storage action. So let's go ahead and call d.storageAction.attach, and attach expects a context and volume ID. So volume ID is going to be request.volume ID, and droplet ID is going to be request.node ID. So this is int here, but request.node ID is actually a string. So we will have to change the request.node ID to int. So let's do that. Node ID colon equals to string con. This is a built-in package that can be used for these type conversions. So string con dot, we have to convert. So attach expects string, no, int droplet ID as int. So we have to convert string to int. So a to I, and then we have to pass request.node ID here. This returns an error as well. So if error is not equals to nil, in that case we have to return nil, and then errors dot new or status dot error codes dot internal was not able to convert node ID to int value. And once we have done that, we can just pass the node ID here, and attach returns, if you see here, action, response and error. So action, response and error. If error is not equals to nil, in that case we have to return internal server error. So return response is going to be nil, and the error is going to be status.error, and codes.internal failed attaching volume to the node. Now I think this handling of errors is not the good idea. I mean, I have not done a good job here, because for example, if any of these calls fail, in that case I'm not sure that this actually captures the error as well. For example, if you see here, I'm not sure if this is going to give us this error as well. So maybe what we will have to do is we will have to do something like this. So failed attaching volume to the node, and error is this. So something like this. So yeah, I mean, I think you will have to do this. I'm not sure if status.error is actually going to include error automatically. So you'll have to wrap the error manually. So now that we have action, response and error, what we can do is, let's go ahead, and we will have to basically wait for this volume to be successfully attached to the node. So what we can do is we'll have to somehow keep checking the action, and we will have to make sure that the action is completed. So if we look at the response, action response, it gets us the ID of the action. So what we are going to do is, let's create a helper here. Wait for completion if error equals to error is not equals to nil. In that case, return nil : status dot error, and the error is going to be codes.internal error percent is s, waiting for volume to be attached, and error is going to be this. And let's go ahead and try to just implement this. So we would need fields from driver. That is the reason let's create a method on driver. So driver wait for completion, and it would also expect the volume ID and the node ID. So d dot storage action dot get, and if you see here, it gets volume ID and it expects volume ID and action ID, and it gives us the details about the action. So it expects volume ID and action ID. So we will have to pass request dot volume ID, and we also have to pass action dot ID. So volume ID string and then action ID int. So volume ID and action ID. Now we will have to keep calling this particular API until and unless the action is completed. So it gives us action, response, and error again. So action, response, and error, and a dot, if you see, we can check the status. So if we go ahead and check the status, we can make sure that if the status is completed or not. And if you see here, this is the const that we can use to make sure that the action is completed. And we have to basically keep calling this, and there is this utility in API machinery package, in the API machinery modules wait package, and this is the function that we are going to use to make sure that the action has been completed, or the volume has been attached successfully to the node. If you see here, it says Paul tries a condition function. So this is the function that is tried until it returns true, an error, or the timeout is reached. So since we are able to figure out if the action is completed or not, in that case, if the action is not completed, we can return a false, and in that case, this particular function would be called again. So until and unless this function returns true, an error, or the timeout is reached, this function would be called continuously in this interval. So let's go ahead and try to do this. So wait dot, so yeah, this is what we wanted. So let's go ahead and just try to build this. I want to build this just to make sure that we are able to go diff is working properly. So go build, and it is going to complain that we don't have go get. Let's see if I can make this work. I actually have already tried this, so it was working then. Okay, so now at least we just have a compilation error. So wait.poll, and in that case we are going to, it expects interval, so we should call this every second. So time 1 into time dot second, and we also have to specify the timeout, and timeout is let's say we should keep it 5 minutes, because yeah, I think within 5 minutes the volume should be attached to the node. So 5 into time dot minute, and then we are also going to call the function that is going to get called every 1 second. So the signature is this, and from this function we have to return, if you see here, we have to return bool and error. So now we are going to call d.storageAction d.storageAction.get. Okay, so it also expects context, so context.background, and it returns action or a colon underscore colon error colon equals to. So if error is not equals to nil, in that case we have to try again. So in that case I would return nil and false, or false comma nil. If error is not nil, in that case I would check the action dot status. If action dot status is equals to, go to dot so status completed. Basically we should see where status completed is. Yeah, so dot action completed. If status is action completed, in that case we can return true and then nil, return false comma nil. This returns an error as well. So error colon equals to this and return error. So now if you again, this can be done I would say in better ways as well. For example, you can pass a context, and if context is being cancelled, in that case you would maybe want to make sure that we abort the operation and things like that. This is a very minimal version to make things working. So now if you see here, we are waiting for the action to be completed, and once the action is completed we just have to return the response. So controller publish volume response, and we have to, let's go ahead and try to look into the volume response. So if you see here now, once the volume is created, so volume was created separately, we had a node. Once we attached this particular volume to this particular node using controller publish volume, now what would happen is this volume now needs to be mounted. So this volume is available as a device on the node, but that device needs to be mounted on the node at a particular location. So in that case we would need to know where exactly that volume is attached as a device. For example, it's going to be attached in let's say dev. And so if you see here, I have this, I have SSH access to my Kubernetes nodes here. So if we go to, for example, dev dis, and we should see some details here. So by label, by part UUID, by path, by UUID, and the volume that is going to be attached to our node is going to be attached somewhere here, and we would verify that obviously, but the volume gets attached using volume name. And so for example, we are going to have a block device here that would have volume name in its name. So that is the reason, if we try to mount this volume, sorry, if we try to mount this device to a target location, we would need to have that volume name. And that mounting from block device to a directory happens in node stays volume call. So node stays volume would actually require the volume name. That is the reason what we are going to do is we are going to pass the volume name in publish context. Again, if you remember, in controller publish volume, we could have accessed some things, some extra information that were sent from create volume request. Similarly, from controller publish volume, we can pass some values, some extra information to node stays or node publish requests RPCs, and that's what we are going to do. We are going to set volume name here, because volume name would be required to actually figure out where the volume is attached. So publish context, and this is map of string and string, and let's call it we can basically call it anything that we want to, because using this key we are going to fetch the value in node stays volume from this particular map. So we can call it anything colon volume dot name. This is the same volume that we get from the storage provider to see if it's present or not. Now we can have it anything, but we cannot actually have it anything, because we are going to use the same key in node stays volume or node publish volume as well. So it's better that we make it a variable maybe, and then we can access this variable as a key in node stays volume as well. So let's go ahead and create a variable in driver.go. So call it we are going to call it volume name key from controller publish. And this is going to be, for example, let's say for now it can be, let's say, slash volume name. So this is not actually, if you do not understand this, just let me know, but this is just a key in the map, and this is the same key that we are going to use when we try to get the values from this map in node stays or node publish volume RPCs. It's just that. So now in controller.go we are going to access that. So okay, now if we run this particular application, we would see that things are actually, we would see that volume is actually being mounted, and if node stays or node publish volume is created, in that case we would be able to get this publish context. Let's go ahead and try to maybe look into that. So let's say node stays volume. If we try to look into the request for node stays volume, we should see publish context, and again if you see here, it is map of string and string, and this would have the same map that we set from controller publish volume, and that is the reason we would need that key to get the value. So now let's just go ahead and try to first of all run the things as they were before, and we would see that a volume is being created, and then we would build this entire application and then run the things again. So if I apply everything from manifests, the pods are starting. There are two worker nodes. That is the reason we see two node plugins, and we can have just one controller node, controller plugin. Controller plugin does not need to be run on all the nodes. So now I'm following the logs of controller plugin, and if I go ahead and try to create a PVC, if you see here, we don't have any volume in my DigitalOcean console right now. So let's go ahead and try to create a PVC and a pod that is going to consume that PVC. So manifests and tests, it's going to create. Okay, so it says unable to authenticate you. I think the reason is I have changed my API key. So let's go ahead. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create the secret once again. Just give me a second. So So I have created the secret.yaml manifest. Once again, I am going to push it, so you would know this anyway, so I will have to change it eventually, so I can even show it to you. But yeah, let's go ahead and see this. So secret.yaml, I have, if you see here, I have changed the access token, and now let's go ahead and apply everything once again. So I'm going to delete the pods just to make sure that the secret that is mounted is refreshed, and the pods are going to get restarted again. Now I'm going to create the PVC and the pod that is going to consume that PVC. So create -f manifests and tests. So if you see here, we should see that controller publish volume of controller plugin was called, and if you remember, we did not deploy the updated code yet. So we just see that controller publish volume of controller plugin was called, and if we go ahead and try to have a look into our DigitalOcean console, we should also see a volume here, and that volume should have a button attached to a droplet, because if you remember, in previous code we did not, we just logged that controller publish volume was called. That is the reason it's not actually attached to any of the nodes. But if we go ahead and try to deploy everything once again, the source code that we have updated, in that case the volume, this volume that is created, is going to get attached to a specific node, because our controller publish volume RPC here is implemented to do that. So let's go ahead and try to delete these things. So I'm going to delete the PVC, PV and volume attachment, and the reason is I have not implemented respective delete RPCs, so this might be a problem. So delete PV all force and grace period 0. Similarly, I'm going to delete PVC as well. Okay, so we don't have a PVC, we don't have a PV. Okay, we have a PV, we have a volume attachment as well. We have to delete these two things. So you should not actually do this, but I want to delete it urgently. That is the reason I'm removing finalizers. Okay, so now we are in a good condition. Let's go ahead and try to build the application. So we have built the application. If you see, the binary was created again, and we are going to build it. So docker build -d, and if we go ahead and try to look into how the image looks like, so this is how it looks like, and we are going to call it 12 and then dot, and let's push it. And we are also going to change these manifests to update the image. We don't actually need to change the node plugin, because we are not changing anything in the node, but just to be on sync, I'm going to change it as well. We just need to change the controller plugin, because controller is the code that we changed in this video. Okay, so now everything is changed. Let's go ahead and try to apply everything once again, and these pods would be restarted again because we have changed the image, and let's wait for them to be up and running. So if you go ahead and try to look for the logs of controller, and let's go ahead and try to look for logs of node plugin as well, and create the pod and PBC. So if you see here, now it says that initially create volume was called, and after that we should see that controller publish volume was also called, and then we will, if you see it, started volume attachment processing. It simply means that now the volume is being attached. Okay, so if you see here, now this is the volume that was just created, the new volume, and now this volume is actually attached to -0 to droplet, and that is the reason we don't see attached to droplet button, because we have now implemented controller publish volume, and controller publish volume actually attached that volume to a particular node. Now, if you see here, we are also seeing some failures, and the reason is, now once after the volume has been attached to the node get capabilities from node plugin is going to get called to see if node stays volume is actually supported or not. So now let's go ahead and try to look into uh, if that, where exactly that volume is attached at. So we know that it's going to be attached as device, so device disk, and if you see by id, if you see here, this is where that volume is attached at, and if you see, this is the volume name that is being used, and that is the reason we have set the volume name in the publish context, so that in node stays volume we can figure out this particular path. We can figure out dev disk by id and this particular name, so that we can mount this particular device to a particular location. So yeah, I think one thing that I'm confused about is, why do I not see this particular log in controller log, or we, okay, so I see it here. Sorry about that. I was a bit worried that we don't see it here. So uh, yeah, I think this is pretty much it that I wanted to talk about in this particular video. If you do not know how these things are communicating with each other, again, I highly recommend watching previous videos. I would push this entire thing on my GitHub repo, so you can check the code out as well. And now what happens is, now that the volume has been attached to the node, we will have to actually mount this volume inside a pod. Again, if you see here, this particular pod that we created, this pod is still not running, and if we try to describe it, we would see why it's not running. So describe pod and then task pod. So if you see here, volume mount dot mount device failed for this particular volume, and because we are not actually mounting, we have attached the volume, but we are not mounting the volume. We have not mounted the volume inside the pod. So yeah, I think this was pretty much it that I wanted to talk about. If you liked this video, if you think this is going to be helpful to your colleagues, classmates, share it with them, and thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.